Hey guys, welcome back. So we started the week talking about railroads. We want to talk about the probably the most famous railroad in the United States, and that's the Transcontinental Railroad. So we showed you some maps yesterday and on Monday. So we have some more maps. We got a little Kylo Ren gif, about more maps. So we're going to be looking at some of those maps right now. So we showed you maps of railroads in Texas and how it grew dramatically over those 20 years from 1860 to 1880. Now we're going to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. So what was so amazing about this is that it stretched from the east coast of the United States all the way to the west coast, the first time that's ever happened. And so many of the railroads of the east coast were all connected, and there were a lot more than what's showing here, but this is just the main Transcontinental Railroad. It went from New York and went through Buffalo, went through down through Lake Erie, through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. It stopped up in Chicago as well. They went down towards St. Louis and into New Orleans. There was also one that went from D.C. down to New Orleans and also connected to the same one over here and down through the East Coast, Savannah, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida. It also continued west through Chicago, Omaha, Nebraska, Denver, Colorado, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Eventually, they got as far to the west as what is known as Promontory Summit in Utah. The west coast side of it started in Sacramento. Eventually, it connected to San Francisco as well. But they started building here, and this blue part of it is the Central Pacific line. So the Union line started in Omaha, Nebraska, and they made it all the way over here to Utah. So they made it a lot further, and I'll tell you why they made it further here in a second. The second team in Central Pacific Railroad started in the west coast, and they were going to meet in the middle. Where they met was Promontory Point or Promontory Summit in Utah near the Great Salt Lake. So the West Coast team, they had to make it across the Sierra Nevada, across a massive desert as well. And so that's what took them a little bit longer, is getting through those mountains and across that desert. The Rocky Mountain part of it that you would think would take a long time, they actually got through pretty quickly. And eventually, like I said, met here at this point in Utah. So from that railroad spanned a ton of other railroads. So you have the original Transcontinental Railroad right here through the middle. Like I said, eventually hooked up into San Francisco. But then tons of other ones came through as well. The Southern Pacific Railroad that connected all of Southern California through Arizona and New Mexico and then into Texas. The Texas and Pacific Railway that also went towards the Pacific Ocean. The Central Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Canadian Pacific. All these different railroads popped up because of the Transcontinental Railroad. So that came first, and then it came back to all of these ones, eventually two major ones that came through Texas as well. The Southern Pacific in 1883 and Texas Pacific in 1881. And so those are the routes that now many of our highways follow as well. And so if you're traveling from Dallas to Fort Worth, or even if you're driving like my dad did and I when we first moved to Texas, we took the same way coming from California, drove all the way through and went through Arizona and Tucson, eventually through New Mexico, stopped in El Paso, and then came across this way into McKinney. And that's the highway that we followed. And it was following the railroad that was set up in the 1870s and 80s. And so that is the path of the Transcontinental Railroad. What I'm going to show you next is a YouTube video talking about the Golden Spike, and this father and his daughter went on a trip together to show you what it looked like today. So they're going to take a little tour of that. So I'll keep talking to you guys after this video.
The Golden Spike is something that I'd always heard about in Utah. The two railroads came together at Promontory. 2019 is the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, and so we thought it would be really cool to make this trip from Salt Lake to Promontory to see the reenactment and to find out more about the Golden Spike and the Transcontinental Railroad. So we thought it'd be neat to leave our house in Salt Lake City along with a bike and take this trip using a train. Get on Front Runner, take Front Runner up as far as we could go, then get on a bus and ride our bikes out to Promontory. It's just really neat understanding, the whole aspect of trains and our history. We've been building a lot of train lines lately, and so we're almost rediscovering the rail here in Utah. When you come into Ogden on the train, you realize that's really how you're meant to come into Ogden. You know, coming to that huge rail yard across the Weber River, the Ogden Union Station and 25th Street, and you see the wall of Mount Ogden behind it, and you're like, oh, this is how you're supposed to arrive in Ogden. So then when we went into the train museum, it gave us a different perspective on that whole history there. With the bikes, it allowed us to explore Bear River Valley in a lot more detail and just slow things down a little bit. Allowed us to poke into places that we might not otherwise have stopped at. When you're traveling with an 8-year-old, you want to make sure that your days aren't too long. Crystal Hot Springs is a really cool place. It's been visited as a hot springs by people in Utah really ever since the time of the Golden Spike. Found ourselves on the shore of the Great Salt Lake on the playa. It was right along the railroad grade from, the Southern Pacific, and so we could see a lot of those ruins. It was a really cool experience to camp out on the playa like that. When we finally got to Promontory, there's that last steep hill that we went up, and so we really understood what the railroads were up against, making that last push up the hill to Promontory Summit. So you see these black and white photos, and it just doesn't do justice to how colorful the train engines are. You had all these people from San Francisco and other big cities literally in the middle of nowhere with these colorful railroad engines. It just really brought it to life.
The driving of the last spike is at hand. At this point, we wish to commend both railroad companies and their workers.
So it's always fun to have people that come out here and they may not know why they're out here. They see the reenactment, they see the locomotives, they get an idea of the history, and then to actually realize why this is such an important part in our nation's history.
This was something that captivated everybody, that the whole country was watching Utah, waiting for this moment when the last spike would be driven in.
So that kind of just shows you the significance of that place. These two railroads met. There was now a railroad connecting the East Coast to the West Coast for the first time, which not only sped up trade, but also travel. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the legacy from the Far East, is what it's known as. But this is the Chinese workers that came from China and East Asia to work on the railroad, mostly on the western side of it that headed towards the East Coast and met in Utah. And so thousands of Chinese people immigrated to the United States at this time to work on making this Transcontinental Railroad. Around 11,000 by the end of the project came from China and settled in the United States. Started in Sacramento with the Pacific Railroad in California. So these Chinese immigrants were brought over. 50 of them were brought over at first, and many of the stereotypes that people had in the United States of these people were that they didn't have the stamina, the strength, or any other traits that would make them good workers. But very quickly, that was proven incorrect. But they had to deal with very demanding work conditions, 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. A lot of people had a lot of stress put on their bodies and their health because of the amount of work that they were doing to get this project done. But it was a pretty monumental project in U.S. history. So at the height of the building of this railroad, they could get about 10 miles of track done in one day, which is pretty amazing. If you've ever seen road construction being done, it's nowhere near that pace. And so many of the things wouldn't have been possible without these Chinese immigrants that came over to the United States and built this railroad. They were paid about $30 or so a month, and they were given daily meals as well, typically dried vegetables and seafood, and a variety of meats combined, with some other things as well. but they had to struggle through a lot of things. Like I said, very hard work days, 10 to 12-hour work days. Constantly, they were being threatened with different diseases, so they had to boil their water as well. But that was part of their tradition, where because they would make tea very often, and so that wasn't that out of the normal for them. But I just want to make sure that the significance of this is the amount of new culture that was brought into the United States and eventually into Texas as well with this railroad, was because of this linking of the East and the West. So that's all I got for today, guys. I'll see you tomorrow for your last video. Have a good rest of your day. Bye, guys.